On November 4th, 2019, a privately funded research team of 5 set out on an expedition to Antarctica. They checked in with the main crew every day. But 3 weeks later, without warning, the transmissions fell silent. When the rescue team reached the camp, everything was intact. There was nothing out of the ordinary, except for 5 sets of footprints heading north, never reaching their destination. There is something about Antarctica that has always drawn people in. Its endless whiteness, its silence, a landscape so extreme it almost feels otherworldly. For over a century, scientists, explorers, and researchers have been willing to spend months in total isolation just to stand on it. And the latest among them was Expedition 804. The research team was composed of 5 people, and each of them was there for a reason. Dr. Orion Bouchard, a glaciologist with 30 years of fieldwork, was responsible for analyzing the ice structures surrounding the site. His wife, Dr. Astrid Bouchard, was brought in to interpret the thermal readings. Dr. Thomas Lavoie was there to assess whatever information lay beneath the surface. Tyler Gagnon was the team's field technician, the person responsible for keeping the equipment running in one of the most hostile environments on Earth. And Donna Cote was the expedition coordinator. The organization behind their expedition was TARCTA, a Montreal-based private scientific body, well-funded and largely unknown to the public. In 2011, a routine radar survey flagged an anomaly beneath a remote section of the Antarctic ice shelf. So 4 years later, TARCTA funded its first expedition to Antarctica to get closer readings. The anomaly was still there, still unexplained. If anything, more interesting than before. In 2019, they funded a second expedition. This time, they weren't taking readings from a distance. They wanted closer eyes on it. Thus, they carefully picked each member of what would become Expedition 804. Their mission was simple: to visit Site 4, a subglacial formation thousands of meters beneath the ice that TARCTA has been watching for years. November 1st, 2019. The 5 departed Argentina. It was a normal departure. Equipment loaded, permits filed, schedules confirmed. By all accounts, nothing about that morning suggested anything other than a routine research expedition heading south. 3 days later, on November 4th, the vessel, Étoile Australe, reached the ice ridge. The 5 disembarked. The vessel's crew watched them disappear into the white and turned back towards Argentina. They were scheduled to return on February 3rd to pick them up. For the first 3 weeks, everything was normal. The team checked in every day, sometimes twice. Dr. Orion reported stable ice conditions around Site 4. Dr. Astrid's thermal readings were consistent with what TARCTA has been monitoring remotely. Dr. Thomas noted the formation was deeper than initially mapped. Tyler logged equipment checks without issue. While the 4 researchers worked the site, Donna Cote remained at the base camp, managing supplies and communications. Nothing in those transmissions suggested anything was wrong. Nothing suggested anything unusual had been found. Until November 30th. Their check-in that day was brief, shorter than any transmission before it. Nothing but confirmation that they were still there. But 2 days later, on December 2nd, they stopped responding. The vessel crew tried getting through that evening, then the following morning, then every hour after that. By December 4th, with still no response, The crew reported everything to the Coast Guard. The rescue team reached the camp 3 days later. There were 6 of them, experienced, well-equipped. They had done remote extractions and emergency retrievals in some of the most hostile conditions on Earth. As the team moved across the ice, they started feeling less worried. Then they saw the tents still standing. There was no visible damage or signs of a weather event. As they got closer, they expected to find 5 people inside. Cold, perhaps. Shaken. Maybe injured. But all of the tents were empty. What was left behind was research equipment and personal belongings, and 5 plates of food inside each tent. Half eaten, still warm. One of the rescuers felt relieved, thinking the research team had survived the blackout after all. And true enough, there were 5 sets of footprints on the snow heading north. Maybe they had gone looking for higher ground, trying to look for a signal. The rescue team followed the footprints for almost 2 kilometers. But then, they stopped. And beyond that last footprint, the snow was completely undisturbed. That was the moment the rescue team understood that this was no longer a search for people who had wandered off. The food was still warm. The rescue team noted it in their report and didn't comment further. But warm food meant the 5 had left their tents within the hour, which meant whatever threw them out onto that ice happened fast. Nobody stopped to put on the extra layers or thought to take anything with them. Something had happened at the end of that trail. The search continued for 3 weeks. They expanded the radius, brought in additional teams, used thermal imaging equipment to scan beneath the ice surface, covered every possible direction from the camp. Every day they went out, but came back with nothing. In the report, the search team noted that the ice shelf beyond the discovered footprints had no crevasse system or surface cracks where 5 people could have fallen through. Weather records showed nothing unusual around December 2nd. There were no environmental or geological factors that could have caused 5 people to disappear at that location. By December 28th, with no leads and conditions on the ice deteriorating, the decision was made to call off the search. The case was handed to a formal investigative body. An inquiry was opened separate from the search to determine what had happened to the 5 researchers. But then, like so many cases before it, the world eventually moved on. And while most, even the families left behind, accepted that some questions would never be answered, there was one who refused to. Camille Bocard was 24 years old when her parents, Dr. Orion and Dr. Astrid, left for Antarctica, and 24 still, technically, when the case was closed in March 2020. She hadn't aged into this. The apartment still smelled like her mother's coffee. Her father's last voicemail was 43 seconds long, and she listened to it so many times, the audio had started to warp at the edges. She had just started her career as a journalist. She knew how cases like these worked, how institutions decided, at some point, that the cost of not knowing was cheaper than the cost of looking. Expedition 804 had been closed the same way a window was closed, quickly and against something coming in. But she wasn't going to let it stay that way. She started the way any journalist would, finding the last people who had seen her parents alive, the vessel crew. But Camille had one problem. The vessel had been privately chartered by TARCTA. That meant whatever records existed weren't accessible to her. And so, Camille spent 4 months calling every licensed Antarctic charter operation in Ushuaia until one of them recognized the vessel name. The operator knew the captain, Robert Grenier. They'd worked the same routes out of Ushuaia for years. He gave her a number. When Camille finally reached him, Robert cooperated and answered her questions. Robert remembered the drop-off clearly. The expedition team disembarked without incident. They seemed focused, professional, not worried. But there was one thing that bothered him that day. The equipment they unloaded that day was slightly heavier than the manifest said it would be. He'd assumed it was a filing error. He didn't think about it again until Camille called. Camille filed it away, a number that didn't quite match. Nothing she could do anything with. Not yet. She filed a Freedom of Information request for the vessel's crew loading log in 2021. While waiting, she tracked down members of the rescue team, hoping there was something they had seen that hadn't made it into the official report. Out of leads, she followed up on the loading request twice. No response. She was frustrated. This was her only lead, and she was starting to think she may never see it. But 2 years later, it arrived. She placed it next to the supply manifest, filed with the Argentine Coast Guard before departure. One of the few expedition documents she'd been able to obtain early on. That's when she found it. A discrepancy. The original supply manifest, filed before the expedition departed, listed a total equipment weight of 2,847 kilograms. The vessel crew's loading log, recorded on the day of departure, listed 2,915 kilograms, a difference of 68 kilograms. 68 kilograms is the weight of an item added after the manifest was filed, something that wasn't supposed to be on record. When she traced it back through the loading log, the extra weight corresponded to a single entry, a transit case logged under Donna Cote's name. And that was when Camille started asking a different question entirely. Not where her parents had gone, but what had Donna brought with her, and why wasn't it on the original manifest? On its own, a discrepancy between a supply manifest and a loading log isn't necessarily suspicious. Manifests get updated. Equipment gets added at the last minute. Paperwork doesn't always keep up with reality. But this was different. The transit case hadn't been added to the manifest at all. It had been logged separately, under a personal name, through a different channel entirely. The name on that case was Donna Cote. She was the expedition coordinator, the only non-scientist on the team. According to the reports, while the 4 researchers spent their days out on the ice working Site 4, Donna Cote stayed at the base camp, alone, managing supplies and communications. She was the last person to handle anything that went in or out of that camp. Camille requested the recovery inventory from the investigative body. If the transit case had been recovered, it would be there. Weeks later, it arrived. The transit case wasn't on the list. Camille thought about it carefully. A missing case, a name on a log, a woman who happened to be alone at camp. She had seen investigators build conspiracies out of less. She'd promised herself she wouldn't do that. But everything else came back. Every last item. Except for the one thing no one was supposed to know about. Whoever Donna was, she had known something that others didn't. Camille Googled Donna Cote. Donna appeared at the Expedition 804 coverage, but only barely. A name in a list. The articles that mentioned her all gave her one line, maybe 2, before moving on to the scientists. But she didn't have much of a public presence. She wasn't on social media. Except her LinkedIn was still up. Camille wasn't expecting to find anything useful. The articles made it clear that Donna was an expedition coordinator. But that didn't appear on her LinkedIn profile at all. In fact, Coordinating wasn't even her specialty. Her actual title, the one she'd held for 6 years before the expedition, was Communications Systems Engineer. The profile listed her specializations: signal suppression, secure transmission monitoring, covert communications infrastructure. She had worked for 3 companies before the expedition. 2 of them were telecommunication firms. The third was a defense contractor. Camille sat back. Why would a communications engineer with a background in signal suppression end up on an Antarctic research team, listed of all things as an expedition coordinator? Camille looked into TARCTA again. They were the ones who carefully chose the people for the investigation. Every other member had qualifications that mapped directly onto the mission. Orion for the ice, Astrid for the thermals, Lavoie for the formation, Gagnon for the equipment. TARCTA hadn't assembled a random team. They had built one deliberately, which meant they had seen Donna Cote's resume too. Camille made a phone call. The number on TARCTA's last public filing rang twice and went to a generic voicemail. She left a message. She tried the email address listed on their website. It bounced. She tried a second number she found in an older press release. Disconnected. She told herself it wasn't unusual. Private scientific bodies didn't always maintain their public presence. People moved on. Numbers changed. But the silence bothered her. It felt like the silence of an organization that was no longer there. She pulled up the Quebec Enterprise Registry. TARCTA was incorporated in 2008, privately funded, listed under Scientific Research and Development. The filings were sparse but consistent up until 2019. And then, in July 2020, 4 months after the Expedition 804 case was formally closed, there was a final entry. Dissolution. Voluntary. Effective immediately. There wasn't even a press release or acknowledgement of Expedition 804 or the 5 people who had vanished under their watch. The organization that had spent nearly a decade monitoring Site 4, that had funded 2 expeditions, that had carefully selected each member of the team, had simply stopped existing. Among the things that dissolved with them were the only coordinates that ever mattered. The expedition permits had listed a general operational zone, enough to satisfy Argentine authorities, but not enough to tell anyone where Site 4 actually was. That information had lived inside TARCTA, and in July 2020, it stopped existing with everything else. Nobody outside of TARCTA had ever known exactly where Site 4 was, which meant nobody could say with certainty where those footprints were going, or what was waiting at the end of them. Camille had spent enough time with that question to know it wasn't one she could answer from a desk in Montreal. Maybe not one she could answer at all. But there were still some questions she could answer. And one of them was why TARCTA had put someone like Donna Cote on that team. So she kept pulling. But if TARCTA couldn't answer that directly, maybe someone else could. Camille called Captain Robert Grenier again. She told him what she had found and asked him about the transit case specifically, if he knew what was inside. Not the weight this time. The loading itself. Robert thought about it. He said the rest of the equipment had been loaded by his crew the way it always was. Checked against the manifest, weighed, logged, stowed. But the transit case was different. Donna had arrived with it separately, in a private vehicle, about an hour after everything else had already been loaded. She hadn't let his crew touch it. She'd overseen every step of it herself, directed exactly where it was to be stowed, made sure it was secured before she walked away. Robert had assumed at the time that it was sensitive scientific equipment. Fragile, maybe. Expensive. It wasn't unusual for researchers to be particular about certain pieces of kit. But thinking about it now, he said, it wasn't the way someone handles fragile equipment. It was the way someone handles something they don't want anyone else to look at. She thanked him and hung up. So Camille now had a communications engineer and an undeclared transit case that its owner handled like a secret. But knowing what Donna was didn't tell what was inside it. For that, she needed a different thread entirely. The transit case had never appeared on TARCTA's official manifest. It hadn't gone through their equipment channels. It had been logged separately, under Donna's personal name, through a different process entirely, which meant it had cleared Argentine customs as a personal import. That was the threat. Because Donna had kept it off the expedition's official paperwork, she had inadvertently made it traceable to herself personally. Her attempt to hide it from TARCTA's records have left it visible somewhere else entirely. Camille didn't have the contacts or the access to pull Argentine customs records herself, but she knew someone who might. She reached out to a journalist based in Buenos Aires, whom she had crossed paths with years earlier. She explained what she was looking for, sent him the date, the port, and Donna's name. It took him 3 weeks. The customs record was 4 pages long. Most of it was standard filing, entry date, port of origin, and declared value. But on page 3, under the equipment category, there was a single line. Electromagnetic monitoring and frequency regulation equipment. Restricted classification. Approved for personal research use. Camille tried to calm herself down. On its own, that sounds like standard research equipment. The kind of thing you'd bring to measure atmospheric conditions or track satellite signals in a remote environment. But frequency regulation equipment doesn't measure signals. It controls them. And if the expedition team had lost contact with the vessel crew, it might have not been an accident at all. Camille checked the reports again. The expedition team was completely unreachable until November 30th. That day, they had checked in only once, briefly, to confirm they were still there. At the time, nobody flagged it. But Camille now had a different reading of that transmission. What if that wasn't the team checking in at all? What if it was the last transmission Donna allowed out? And if that was true, then December 2nd, the day the camp went silent, wasn't a blackout. It was a decision. But why would Donna do something like that? Camille had 2 theories. The first was that Donna hadn't acted alone. TARCTA had placed her on that team from the beginning, not as an expedition coordinator, not even as a communications engineer, but as a contingency. Someone who was supposed to be there if the team found something they weren't supposed to bring back. If her parents had found something at Site 4 that TARCTA wanted contained, the organization had every incentive to make sure it stayed that way. But there was another possibility, one that had nothing to do with orders. TARCTA had selected Donna for exactly the right reasons. She had the skills they needed. She was the right person for the job on paper. But somewhere, between being hired and stepping onto that ice, something changed. Maybe she figured out what TARCTA actually intended. Maybe she made contact with someone she shouldn't have. Maybe she couldn't go through with it when she was finally standing there. So she turned. The signal interference equipment she brought wasn't for jamming the camp. It was for protecting her own transmissions from TARCTA intercepting them. She was trying to get something out. Documentation. Evidence. whatever the team had found at Site 4. But this is where both theories collapsed. Because regardless of whether Donna was following orders or trying to stop them, the footprints told the same story. 5 sets, walking north, calm and evenly spaced. 2 kilometers, and then nothing. If Donna were the villain, if she had lured 4 people out onto open ice to silence them, she was walking alongside them, toward the same endpoint. And if she had turned against TARCTA, if she were trying to get something out, trying to protect the team, she still ended up at the same last footprint. Either way, whatever was waiting at the end of the trail didn't distinguish between the person who set it in motion and the people who never saw it coming. That was the part Camille kept returning to. Not who Donna was or what she intended, but what could have happened in that final stretch of ice that left no trace, no struggle, no body, and no answer. Just undisturbed snow in every direction. We know what about Antarctica has always drawn people in, but what they don't tell you is how many of them it is kept. Beneath its whiteness, there is a darkness that doesn't let go. Over the decades, Antarctica has taken more than it has returned. In 1916, 3 members of Shackleton's Ross Sea Party disappeared on the ice during a supply mission. They were never found. In 2011, a vessel called the Berserk vanished near the continent with 3 men on board. There was no wreckage or bodies found. In 2024, a high-tech unmanned submarine disappeared beneath the Thwaites Glacier during what should have been a routine mission. Despite over 40 successful dives, it was never recovered. Antarctica doesn't distinguish between the prepared and the unprepared, between the ones who knew the risks and the ones who didn't. Expedition 804 is among them now. Camille Bocard is 30 years old. She has spent 6 years building a case that no investigative body has been willing to formally pursue. A case that exists, for now, only on the walls of her office in Montreal. She still doesn't have an answer. But she may not be as alone in her suspicion as she once was. By 2026, federal officials in the United States were actively investigating a theory that has been circulating for years, that at least 11 scientists working in nuclear, aerospace, and defense research had been deliberately targeted for what they knew. Nobody has officially connected those cases to Expedition 804. And to this day, nobody knows what Expedition 804 found at the end of that trail. Only that whatever it was, it didn't let them come back.